There is a kind of wound that doesn't bleed on the outside. It doesn't show up on your skin. It doesn't leave a bruise. It doesn't make people stop and ask, "Are you okay?" No. This kind of wound hides behind a perfectly set dinner table, behind a turkey carved with a silver knife, behind the sound of laughter that never quite includes you. I've carried that wound for most of my adult life. And for a long time, I told myself it was nothing. I told myself families are complicated. I told myself that maybe I was too sensitive, too emotional, too much. I convinced myself that being shut out of the one holiday that is supposed to celebrate gratitude and togetherness was somehow my fault. It wasn single quotes. And the day I finally understood that, really understood it, deep in my bones, everything changed. My name is Claire. I'm 38 years old. I live in a small town in Ohio, in a house I've filled with potted plants and warm candles, and the kind of peace that took me years to build. I have a daughter named Mia who is 12 and bold in everything I was never allowed to be. I have a life I am proud of, but that life was built on the ashes of something that almost destroyed me. And it started with Thanksgiving. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not the very beginning, not my childhood, not the awkward teenage years, but to the moment when things first started to crack. The moment I first felt the fault line beneath my family's perfectly polished surface. My sister Diane was 31. 5 years between us, and a world of difference in the way our parents saw us. Diane was always the golden child. I say that without bitterness now. I've done enough therapy to call it what it was, without letting it swallow me. But back then, the word golden felt more like a weapon than a description. She was the firstborn. She was the one who never disappointed. She married young, married well, had 2 children who were always presented to the family like little trophies at every gathering. She lived 20 minutes from our parents' house. She had Sunday dinners there. She knew which drawer my mother kept the good silverware in, because she had always been welcome in that kitchen. I had not always been welcome. I was the one who left. At 22, fresh out of college with a literature degree and a hunger for something I couldn't name, I packed 2 suitcases and moved to Chicago. My mother cried at the airport. My father told me to be careful. Diane, standing behind them both with her arms crossed, said nothing. That nothing echoed for years. In Chicago, I built a life. Small and quiet at first, a studio apartment, a job at a publishing company, a small circle of friends who laughed loudly and didn't need family approval to feel whole. I dated. I made mistakes. I grew. I changed. And every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every Easter, I drove back to Ohio or flew back when I couldn't afford to drive, because that's what you do. You go home, even when home has edges. The Thanksgiving I need to tell you about happened on a cold Thursday in November, 6 years ago. I had recently moved back to Ohio after a difficult breakup in Chicago. I was raw. I was tired. I was, if I'm honest, a little lost. I'd moved into a small apartment in Columbus, started a new job at a local magazine, and was slowly trying to rebuild. My mother had called me the week before to remind me about Thanksgiving dinner. "You're coming, aren't you?" she said. There was a lightness in her voice, the kind that covers something heavier. "Of course," I said. "I'll bring the cranberry sauce." She laughed. "Diane's already making her cranberry sauce." Of course she was. "Then I'll bring wine," I said. "That would be lovely, Claire. We'll see you at 4. I hung up feeling the old familiar mix of longing and dread. I wanted to belong there. I always wanted to belong there. But every time I walked through that front door, I felt like a guest in someone else's memory. I didn't know then that I wouldn't even make it through the front door this time. The drive to my parents' house took about 40 minutes. I remember the radio was playing something warm and nostalgic, and I was in a better mood than usual. I'd bought a nice bottle of red wine, changed into a deep green blouse that I loved, and told myself this year would be different. This year I would try harder. I would not let Diane's sharp little comments get under my skin. I would laugh with my niece and nephew and help my mother in the kitchen, and maybe, this Thanksgiving would feel like what it was supposed to feel like. I pulled up to my parents' house just before 4 o'clock. The porch light was on. The windows were warm and golden. Through the glass, I could see the shapes of people moving, my mother near the kitchen, someone sitting at the dining table. I reached for the wine bottle, my bag, and stepped out of the car. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Diane. 3 words. Just 3. Don't come in. I stood there in the cold, staring at my phone screen, certain I had misread it. I read it again, then again. Don't come in. I typed back. What? Why? The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then her response came. Mom and Dad think it's better if you don't come tonight. Too much tension lately. Let's just get through the holiday. You can see them another time. I remember the cold then. Really feeling it. Like it had pushed through my coat and settled right in the center of my chest. I looked up at the house. The warm windows. My mother's shape moving past the kitchen doorway. She knew I was out here. She had to know. My car was in the driveway and she hadn't come to the door. I called Diane. It rang 3 times, then went to voicemail. I called my mother. She answered on the second ring. Claire, she said. Her voice was careful. The voice she used when she was trying not to have a conversation. Mom, what is going on? I'm in your driveway. A long pause. I know, sweetheart, I think it might be better if you headed home tonight. There's been some tension and Diane thinks. I heard my voice change. Mom, this is Thanksgiving. This is your house. What do you mean, Diane thinks? Another pause. She's worried about the atmosphere. You know how things get between the 2 of you. We just want a peaceful holiday, so you're asking me to leave. Without even coming inside. Silence, Mom, answer me. I'm sorry, Claire. I'll call you tomorrow. The line went dead. I stood in that driveway for what felt like a very long time. The wine bottle was still in my hand. The porch light was still on. And through the warm golden windows of my parents' house, my family was sitting down to Thanksgiving dinner. Without me, I drove home in silence. I didn't cry, not yet. I was in that numb place that comes just before the real pain arrives. I poured myself a glass of wine at my kitchen table, looked at my empty apartment, and thought, this is where I live now. Not just in this apartment, but in this place, the one just outside the door, always on the other side of the glass. What I didn't know that night, what I couldn't possibly have known, was that this moment was just the beginning. That the real story hadn't started yet. That what my sister had done, and why she had done it, would eventually come to light in a way none of us could have predicted. And that the truth, when it finally arrived, would change everything. But first I had to understand what I was up against. I had to understand Diane, not the version of her I'd grown up with. Not the older sister who used to braid my hair on Sunday mornings, or the girl who once held my hand at our grandmother's funeral. That Diane was real, and I loved her, and I missed her every day. I'm talking about the Diane she had become. Or perhaps, the Diane she had always been, underneath. Diane had always needed to be the center of things. Not in a loud, dramatic way. She was too clever for that. She was the kind of person who controlled rooms quietly, who shaped narratives with soft words and well-timed tears, who could make you feel chosen and then make you feel worthless in the same afternoon. She was charming to everyone outside the family. She was generous, organized, quick to volunteer for things. She planned the baby showers and the holiday parties and the neighborhood fundraisers. She sent birthday cards on time and remembered everyone's dietary restrictions. She was, by every visible measure, a wonderful person, but she could not share the light, not with me, not when I was in the room. I don't know when it started, this competition she felt between us. When we were children, maybe. I was the one people called creative, and she was the one people called capable. And perhaps that distinction felt like a slight to her even though it was never meant to be. I was the one who won the writing competition in middle school. The one who got the scholarship for the summer arts program. The one who had professors praise her essays. And Diane was the one who was class president, who got into the best college. Who graduated with honors and married a man our parents adored, and gave them grandchildren. First thought we should have been proud of each other. Instead, somewhere along the way, I became her opposite. I became the thing she defined herself against. And for years, I let her. That night, after Thanksgiving, I sat with a glass of wine in my empty apartment, and I thought about all the times I'd let her. All the times I'd laughed off her comments. All the times I'd excused her behavior because families are complicated. Because she's stressed. Because you know how Diane is. All the times I'd made myself smaller so she could feel larger. I thought about the way my mother had said it might be better, and the way the line had gone dead, and something in me, quiet and certain, said, "Not this time, not this time." The days after Thanksgiving were strange. My mother called the next morning, as promised. Her voice was warm and a little too careful, the way it always got when she was trying to apologize without actually saying she was sorry. "I hope you had a restful evening," she said. I almost laughed. A restful evening? I had spent Thanksgiving alone, eating crackers and cheese and finishing the wine I'd bought for her table. But I didn't say that. I said I was fine. "We missed you," she added. I wanted to ask her why she hadn't said that when I was standing in her driveway. I didn't. I said something non-committal and ended the call and sat with the low, quiet ache of it for a while. Over the following weeks, I learned the shape of what had happened. My mother, piece by piece, filled me in, not intentionally, but in the fragmented way that truth leaks out of families that have been told to stay quiet. She mentioned something Diane had said, then something my father had agreed with, then a concern that had been raised, and slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room, the image became clear. Diane had told them I was unstable. Not in those exact words. Diane was never that direct. But she had painted a picture. She'd told my parents that I was going through something after my breakup, that she was worried about me, that having me at Thanksgiving might create tension and upset the children. She had framed her cruelty as concern. She had wrapped it in the language of care so that our parents, who loved her and trusted her and had never quite learned to question her, had nodded along and agreed that maybe this year it would be better if Claire didn't come. She had decided, and they had followed. What broke something in me was not even the cruelty of it. It was the ease. How effortlessly she had erased me from the table. How quickly my parents had accepted the erasure. How none of them had called me beforehand. How my father had sat in that warm dining room and cut the turkey and never once looked out the window to see if I was in the driveway. Spent December trying to hold myself together. I went through the motions of the holiday season, put up a small tree, bought gifts for my niece and nephew, attended a few work parties, and smiled with my whole face. I told no one what had happened. I didn't have the words for it yet, and besides, I was still in the stage where you convince yourself it wasn't as bad as it felt, but it was as bad as it felt. Christmas that year was a small, careful gathering. Diane was there, of course, glowing and organized, wearing a cream-colored sweater that my mother had complimented 3 times by dinner. I was there too. I had been invited. A fact that felt almost insulting given what had happened a month before. As if Thanksgiving had never happened. As if we'd all agreed to pretend it hadn't. Diane greeted me at the door with a hug that lasted exactly long enough to look genuine. "You look tired," she said. "I'm fine," I said. "You should try that magnesium supplement I mentioned. You'd sleep so much better." I smiled. She moved on. I watched her float through the room, touching her husband's arm, laughing at my father's jokes, helping my mother arrange the dessert table. She was everywhere, and I was, as always, slightly off to the side. That Christmas, I watched her more carefully than I ever had before. Not with bitterness, or not only with bitterness. With the curious, attentive eye of someone who was finally allowing themselves to see clearly. I saw how she redirected every conversation back to herself. How she subtly corrected my stories. How she asked my parents questions in a way that excluded me from the answers. How she managed the family narrative the way a director manages a film, quietly, invisibly, from behind the camera. I saw how good she was at it, and I understood. Standing in my parents' living room with a glass of sparkling cider I didn't want, that I had never been in a fair fight. I had been a character in her story. Not the villain, she was too careful for that. But a minor character? A cautionary tale. The little sister who left and struggled and needed handling. I drove home that night in the dark, and I made a decision. I was going to stop fighting on her terms. I was going to stop trying to earn my place at a table that had always treated me like a guest. I was going to stop explaining myself, defending myself, making myself smaller. I was going to build something of my own, something she couldn't reach, and I was going to wait, not for revenge. Exactly. I didn't have a plan. I wasn't scheming. I was just finally done performing. The next year was one of the hardest and best of my life. I poured myself into my work. I pitched stories I believed in, stayed late to get them right, built relationships with editors who respected my voice. I started running in the mornings, not because I was trying to improve myself in some performative way, but because the silence of it helped me think. I started therapy, real therapy, with a woman named Dr. Yemi who had a laugh like warm coffee and absolutely no tolerance for the way I minimized my own pain. "You keep saying you're fine," she told me one afternoon, "but your body tells a different story." "My body is dramatic," I said. She didn't smile. "Your body is telling you the truth. You've been trained not to listen to it." She was right. I learned, over months of slow and sometimes painful work, that I had spent most of my life accommodating a family dynamic that was built around Diane's comfort. I had done it so naturally, so automatically, that I had genuinely believed it was just how families worked, that some people were simply more central than others. That being on the edges was my natural place. It wasn't. It was a role I'd been assigned. And I had a choice about whether to keep playing. It was during this year of quiet rebuilding that I also met Daniel. We met at a friend's birthday gathering, a low-key dinner party at someone's apartment in Columbus. He was tall and soft-spoken, and worked in landscape architecture. He laughed at something I said about a book, and it was so genuine, so uncomplicated, that I didn't know what to do with it. I was not looking for someone. I had barely finished putting myself back together from the last relationship. But Daniel was patient and kind, and he asked questions like he actually wanted to hear the answers. We started seeing each other slowly, no pressure. No performance. I didn't tell my family about him for a long time. I kept things separate on purpose. I had was learning that the things I loved needed to be protected from the family dynamic before they were strong enough to survive it. Daniel needed to know me, the real me, without the shape my family put on me. By the following spring, he knew about the Thanksgiving, about Diane, about the years of standing slightly outside things. He didn't try to fix it or explain it away. He just listened, and then he said, "I'm sorry. That sounds really lonely." And that was it. That was all I needed. Just someone to see it clearly. But life, as it does, was building toward something I couldn't see yet. Diane had been managing the family narrative for so long that she'd forgotten something important about control. It requires constant maintenance. The moment you stop tending the story, the edges start to fray. The details start to shift. And the people you've kept in the dark start to find their way toward the light. My aunt, my father's older sister, Helena, had always been my favorite person in the extended family. She was sharp and irreverent, and had zero patience for nonsense. She'd lived in Portland for most of my adult life, but she visited Ohio every summer and called me every few weeks, because, she said, I was the only one in the family who gave a straight answer. One spring evening, Helena called me. I was making dinner, and I almost didn't pick up. "I'm glad I did. Tell me something," she said. "Did you know that Diane has been telling people you had some kind of breakdown?" I set down my wooden spoon. "A breakdown," I repeated. "That's what she's been saying. To your parents? To a few cousins? That you're unstable? That you're difficult to be around?" I felt something cold move through me. "How do you know this?" "Because she told me to. Called me last fall, all sweet concern, saying she was worried about you. She wanted me to know in case I heard anything, so I'd know the context." The word context landed like a stone. "She was laying the groundwork," I said softly. "That's exactly what she was doing," Helena said. I didn't believe a word of it. For what it's worth, I know you, but I thought you should know she was doing it. After we hung up, I sat with the information for a long time. I thought about what it meant that Diane hadn't simply excluded me from one dinner, but that she had been systematically building a case against me. A quiet, persistent campaign, drip by drip, year by year, She had been reshaping the family's perception of me, and I had given her almost no resistance, because I hadn't known the shape of what she was doing. But now, I did, and that changed things. I thought about confronting her directly. I rehearsed the conversation in my head 100 times. I thought about calling my parents and telling them what I'd learned. I thought about sending a long email, laying everything out with calm and precision. I did none of those things. Not because I was afraid. Not because I was still playing small. But because I had learned, slowly and painfully, that the need to force someone to understand what they've done is its own kind of trap. You can spend your whole life trying to make someone see their own cruelty, and they will never see it. Not because they can't, but because they don't want to. What I needed was not a confrontation. What I needed was time, and I had learned to be patient, so I kept building. I kept working. I kept loving Daniel, kept raising myself up, kept healing the places in me that had been quietly, steadily damaged over decades of being made to feel like an inconvenience. I kept living, and life beautiful, complicated, unwilling to be controlled, kept moving. The second Thanksgiving that followed, and the third I spent with Daniel and his family. Warm, loud, full of people who were delighted to meet me and who never once made me feel like I had to earn my seat. I helped in the kitchen without being redirected. I told stories without being corrected. I laughed without watching to see if anyone was laughing along. I called my mother on those Thanksgivings. She always sounded a little sad. A little uncertain, maybe, about what had been lost. I was not unkind. But I did not perform, and slowly, the distance gave me clarity. I began to see not just what Diane had done, but what my parents had allowed. How their desire for peace had always come at the cost of fairness. How they had mistaken quiet for harmony and compliance for love. How they had handed Diane the keys to our family story and trusted her to drive it, without ever asking whether the passengers in the back were okay. My father, especially. He was a good man, I believe that, still, but he was a man who did not like conflict, who dealt with tension by looking away from it, who had never in his life sat Diane down and said, "This is not okay." I grieved that too. The father I had wanted, the one who might have stood up for me. I grieved him the way you grieve something you never had, quietly, with a particular kind of ache. But grieving is different from being defeated. And I was not defeated. I was waiting, not for revenge, not for collapse, just for the truth to do what the truth always eventually does, find its way to the surface. 3 years after that first Thanksgiving in the driveway, my mother called me on a Tuesday morning in early November. Her voice was different, stripped of its careful layers. She sounded like she had been crying, or was close to it. "Claire," she said, "I need to talk to you. Can you come this weekend?" I said yes. I drove to my parents' house on a gray Saturday. Daniel in the passenger seat, his hand on my arm as we pulled into the driveway. I had told him he didn't have to come. He'd insisted. "You shouldn't have to walk into that alone," he said. So he waited in the car, and I walked to the door. My mother met me before I could knock. She pulled me into a hug, a real one, long and unself-conscious, and I felt something in me shift. Some locked thing, finally giving. We sat at the kitchen table. My father came in from the backyard, sat down across from me. He looked tired, older. "We owe you an apology," my mother said. Her hands were wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking. "More than one?" I looked at her. I waited. She told me everything. It came out in pieces, some things I knew, some I didn't. Diane's husband, Marcus, had confided in my father. Quietly, carefully, the way people do when a situation has become impossible to contain. He'd told my father about the calls Diane had been making over the years, to relatives, to family friends, to my parents themselves. The careful campaign to reframe my character, the Thanksgiving and what had actually driven it. It hadn't been about tension. It hadn't been about protecting anyone from an unstable family member. It had been about a house, my grandmother's house, our grandmother, my father's mother. A woman I had loved deeply had passed away 18 months earlier. She had owned a small farmhouse about an hour outside Columbus. Nothing grand, but full of our family's history. I had spent summers there as a child. I had helped her plant her garden. I had sat on her porch with her and read novels, while the insects hummed in the fields, in her will. She had left the house to be divided equally between her two granddaughters, me and Diane. Diane had not accepted this quietly. She had gone to work immediately, in her quiet and methodical way, building the case that I was unreliable, unstable, unsuited to Cone property. She'd lobbied my parents, lobbied my aunts and uncles, created the impression of a woman in crisis, all so that when the inheritance was discussed, it would seem natural, reasonable, almost charitable, to suggest that perhaps I should sign over my half. The Thanksgiving exclusion had been calculated. She had wanted me isolated, off balance, visibly struggling, so that when the moment came, I would already look like someone who needed to be managed. She had been playing a long game. And she had been playing it against her own sister. My father's voice broke when he told me this. He pressed his hands flat on the table and said, "I should have seen it. I should have asked more questions. I trusted her. I trusted that she had your best interests at heart." I looked at him, at the grief in his face, at my mother's hands around the tea she wasn't drinking. "I know," I said, and I meant it. Not as an absolution, not yet, but as something true. He had trusted wrongly. He had looked away when he should have looked closer. And that had cost me. But he was here now, hands flat on the table, facing what had happened. That mattered. What came next took months. Long, careful months of truth and difficulty, and the slow, painful process of our family learning to be honest with each other for perhaps the first time. Marcus, Diane's husband, had finally reached his limit. He had watched her manage and manipulate for years, and he had loved her and made excuses for her, but the campaign against me had been a line he could no longer step over. He had 2 daughters. He had looked at them one evening and thought about what it would mean for one of them to do to the other what Diane had done to me, and he had gone to my father the next day. Their marriage was struggling. That much became clear over the following months. Not because of me. I want to be careful here. What happened between Diane and Marcus was theirs. But a person who is willing to destroy her own sister to protect her material interests is a person who brings that same willingness to every relationship in her life. Eventually it finds you. Eventually the people around you understand what they're looking at. As for Diane herself, she denied it at first. Fully, furiously, with tears and wounded dignity. She told my parents I was lying. She told them Marcus was lying. She told them she had always only wanted what was best for the family. But Marcus had records, texts, emails, the quiet documentation of a man who had watched something unfold for years, and, at some point, had started keeping track. The facade. When it finally came down hard. I did not watch with satisfaction. I want to be honest about that. I did not feel triumphant. When my mother called me to tell me that Diane had finally admitted to things, finally, in a tearful kitchen conversation that I was not there for, I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired, and sad, and underneath the sadness, a small, warm, persistent relief. It was over. The weight I had been carrying, the shapeless, nameless weight of not being believed was gone. I sat with Daniel that evening on our porch. We had moved in together by then. Into a house with a small garden I was learning to tend, and I held his hand and looked at the sky going dark above the trees. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. What happened after was neither dramatic nor perfectly resolved. Families are not films. There is no clean ending, no single moment of reckoning that erases the years before it. Diane and I did not reconcile easily. We are, even now, somewhere in the careful middle ground between estranged and family speaking at certain gatherings, keeping a cautious distance, learning slowly what a relationship between us might look like when it is no longer built on my silence. Some days I think we might find our way to something real. Other days I'm not sure. I have stopped needing the answer. My parents and I rebuilt our relationship slowly. Honestly, my mother began calling me more. Not the careful calls of someone managing a situation, but real calls, the kind where she told me things she was thinking about and asked me things she actually wanted to know. My father, in his quiet way, began to show up. He came to Columbus one afternoon just to have lunch. He asked me about my work. He listened. It was such a simple thing, and it meant everything.
The farmhouse, my grandmother's farmhouse. I inherited my half. I haven't decided what to do with it yet. Sometimes Daniel and I drive out there on Sunday afternoons and walk through the fields where I used to run as a child. The porch is still there. The garden is overgrown, but the bones of it are still visible. I think we might restore it. I think my grandmother would have liked that. My daughter Mia, who came into my life when Daniel and I got married, and I adopted his daughter from his first marriage. She is 12 now, bold and clear-eyed, and entirely herself. She has never been made to feel that she has to earn her place at any table. She walks into rooms like she belongs there, because she does, and I made sure she knew it. I think about that sometimes, about what I am teaching her, quietly, by the way I move through the world, about the difference between the mother I was raised by, who loved me but let the peace of a room cost me my place in it, and the mother I am learning to be. I am not a perfect mother. I am not a perfectly healed person. I still have the places where the old wound lives. The tightening when I feel excluded. The old reflexive shrinking when someone speaks with too much authority about who I am. I am still learning. I am still, some days, reminding myself that I am allowed to take up space. But I am here. I am whole. I have a porch and a garden and a daughter who laughs like she means it. And every Thanksgiving, every single Thanksgiving, I set the most beautiful table I know how to set. I put candles on it and cloth napkins and the good wine. I make the cranberry sauce from scratch, the way my grandmother taught me when I was 7 years old, standing in her farmhouse kitchen with sticky hands and flour on my shirt. I make it the way she made it. And when we sit down, and the table is full of people who love each other honestly and without conditions, I say a small private thank you. Not to some idea of justice, not to the universe for finally giving me what I deserved. To myself, for staying, for not disappearing when someone tried to make me. For understanding, slowly and then all at once, that the seat at the table I had been looking for was never in my parents' dining room. It was not something anyone could give me or take from me. I had to build it myself, and I did. If you have ever been the one standing outside the warm window, the one who is told, in 100 quiet ways, that you are too much or not enough, that there is no room for you at the table that should be yours, I want you to hear this. The people who need to diminish you to feel whole are the ones who are afraid of what you would become if they didn't. Let them be afraid. And then go build something so beautiful it speaks for itself. The truth always finds its way. Not always on your timeline, not always in the way you imagined, but it finds its way. It always does. And on the other side of it, if you are still standing, and you will be still standing, there is a table, and there is a seat, and it has always had your name on it. You just had to wait long enough to see it.